Yes, certainly. Good afternoon. We are delighted to be hosting this webinar on diversity and inclusion. Welcome everyone to today's webinar hosted by ECIS. ECIS is the Educational Collaborative of International Schools, established for 55 years as a not-for-profits organisation. We have over 500 members in 78 countries. I am Cam Chauhan and I will be hosting today with my colleague Georgie McIntyre. During these challenging times, diversity and inclusion has taken centre stage in our communities. We must work together and bring the changes the world needs. We here at ECIS strive to create an all-inclusive community. This is reflected in our workforce and our Board of Trustees. As mentioned, our membership body represents schools in 78 countries. We know that education and educators play a vital role in creating the change. Georgie, would you like to introduce our panellists?
Absolutely. So ECI stands for Justice, Equality, Inclusion, Respect and the Acceptance of Diversity. It is my pleasure today to welcome the panel that join us. Together we have Claire Nuttall, currently in her 6th year at St George's International School in Luxembourg. Claire has seen the school through 2 excellent inspections and watched the numbers in primary grow significantly year on year. Claire loves the international vibe and diverse mix of students. Angeline Au, international educator, pedagogical leader, cognitive coach and teacher trainer. Angelina founded the Women Ed DE in German network. She is passionate about developing and implementing learning frameworks that address diversity and access to learning, promoting intercultural understanding. Next, we're joined by Amjad Ali. Amjad Ali is a senior leader and trainer, and he's worked with all sectors, from trainee teachers to head teachers, providing training on teaching and learning and inclusion. Amjad has been involved in setting up initiatives such as Culture Box Ed to help address the imbalance of diversity across the country. Sneha Khalif, inspired by the famous Gandhi quote, "Be the change you want to see in the world." Sneha has developed expertise on diversity, inclusion and management leadership development over the past 20 years. I am Georgie McIntyre. I'm part of the senior leadership team here at ECIS as a Chief Learning Officer. I strategically lead on the growth and global expansion of all ECIS's services and professional development for educators. I thrive on developing our community of educators to ultimately impact students' outcomes. Cam is a member of the senior leadership team alongside myself, serving as Chief Operating Officer. She has over 20 years of business experience and she is committed to empowerment through education, inclusion and diversity. It's my pleasure now to hand over to Cam to share her story.
Thank you. So the key questions we're going to discuss today is why it is imperative for our world to have a better understanding of diversity and inclusion. How can we nurture and develop better understanding in ourselves, each other and children? But before I do that, as Georgie said, I'm going to tell a little story. You could just go to the next slide, please, Georgie.
Yeah.
Thank you. So this was my first lesson in diversity. Before I became an educator, which is my vocation, I worked in business for some 20 years. I went to work for Cartland Promotions and worked from their family home. So this is their family home. As you can see, it's quite grand. And I used to work in the middle where you can see the pink curtain just at the top of the front door. Cartland Promotions are a small set of businesses run by the famous author Barbara Cartland's family. Barbara Cartland was step-grandmother to Princess Diane. So I hope this sets the scene for my first lesson in diversity. I grew up in Wolverhampton. This is a picture of my uncle and my dad. They are both Sikh gentlemen. We lived in the constituency where Enoch Powell was MP and gave his infamous speech, The Rivers of Blood. This is a picture of both of them in their regulation West Midlands uniforms, and they had to sign contracts of employment to say they would be clean shaven and wear their hair short and not wear turbans. The next picture is a picture of me aged 5. I went to school at the age of 5 not speaking any English at all, and it was quite common in my particular community. So I just wanted to share this with you because I think it's important to share that a journey a child can make. So the next slide, we're back at Cartlands. So I was working for Cartlands, and this was truly intriguing to me. I was the only person of colour working for them, and I was about 25 years the junior of everyone that worked with me. I worked in finance. So our lesson in diversity for the organisation and for me was that I brought a whole new perspective to them, a new way of working, changing traditional ways of doing things with creative new solutions, and making the processes more streamlined, problem-solving things that they'd not been able to resolve, because I had a completely new and different view to what they had. Very quickly, though, we became a team. I worked alongside Ian, the younger son, and even though everything about our upbringing had been very different, we quickly learned of all the commonalities we shared. We both shared a good sense of humour and a love of books. They were very kind and thoughtful employers, and I will always recall my 4 years there very fondly. If you ask any parent or teacher what they wish for the children in their care, the answers are always very similar. They want them to be happy, healthy, and fulfilling their potential. The more we communicate and share our stories, the more we discover the commonalities and the connections we have. I'd like to hand back to Georgie to now open up the discussion.
Thank you very much, Cam, for sharing your story. We would like to invite everybody that's in attendance today to pose your questions on the Q&A box. So please feel free to actually load those up, and I will be sharing them out to the panel for questions and discussions. But initially, I'd like to invite Claire to share some of her experiences and stories around diversity.
Hi. It's such a broad issue to share with, but I guess as a head teacher, initially I was a head teacher in London, inner London, and my borough that I worked in was really quite diverse, and I enjoyed working with staff from right across the spectrum. So when I became an international head teacher, it was a surprise for me to work with a different demographic of people, and I learned that on the international sector we were not as diverse as we were in inner London. Of course, I've seen later that it was very specific where I was, even in wider London, beyond in UK, the sort of diversity of the teams I worked with was very different. And I think lesser for not having those different viewpoints and the different kind of representation that brings so many different ideas, but also value and worth to the children who are in our schools. Because of course our international schools are so broad, and our groups of children, we're proud of the fact that they represent so many different countries. I'm also a mum. My husband is West African, and my 2 children, I have a son now who is just 16 and a daughter who's 13, and they too are growing up in this world. They're aware of particularly what's happening in the world at the minute. And as a mum of children of dual heritage, I have different conversations with them, I suspect. I was talking with Georgie a while back and discussing the fact that as my son is now 16, I wanted to discuss with him what he might do in London or even in Luxembourg if he was stopped and searched by the police, because statistics show that as a black young man, he's more likely to be stopped and searched by the police. And I realized I was going to have that kind of conversation with him, where I prepared him for something that could happen to him and how it could impact on him. I haven't had that conversation with my daughter, but I want them just to be well-grounded, well-rounded individuals, but they do need to be prepared for the world itself as well.
Excellent, thank you, Claire. So have you got sort of any strong opinions about how we can nurture and develop ourselves better, and develop an understanding in our children as well?
Absolutely. I do think that representation in schools on our staffing bodies is really important. I think at all levels. It shouldn't ever be at one level. So you should have that diverse representation, because by having the range, you're actually modeling to your children. You're showing them that they're important and have value. So that's key, apart from the value, as Cam said, that you bring by having a diverse team. Just by having that range of ideas goes without saying. But for an international body, we should be showing and reflecting our own children. And of course, the curriculum. I mean, if you look at the UK national curriculum, we're a British school here, there is no necessity to discuss that history. There's no, the curriculum itself doesn't look at colonialism. It doesn't look at the history of the slave trades that are now, when we're looking at all the statues that are being taken down, when we're looking at some of the negative impacts of our history, they aren't necessarily tackled. Or through the literature that we're reading, some of the great Black or Asian writers, are we covering those in our curriculum? So to me, if we can bring that into our school curriculum and educate all of our students, then we've got a better understanding and a better viewpoint to start with.
Yeah, totally with you here, Claire.
Yeah.
I think before the preparation when we met first, you shared with me that story about preparing your sons for if they were stopped by the police and how to react. And for me, I found that really quite shocking, because we both have identical age children, and this was not something I'd ever considered that I'd need to actually address or support my children with. So as a mum, it must be extremely concerning as well. But yes, that support and nurture and acting as role models, I think, as well, is such a valuable insight. Amjad, hello. I saw you had a little visitor there.
My little supervisor just come in to check what I was doing.
He can join.
Yeah, well, he gets bored very quickly. He just makes sure that I'm still working and then he leaves.
Checking in on you.
Yeah, exactly. He needs to just make sure he knows what he's paying me for, see?
Excellent. I know you've got a huge body of work, and I'd love, Cam shared with me, I'd love for you to be able to share some of what you've been doing to how to actually address this and try and change the way that people are approaching things.
I mean, yeah, of course. So Black Lives Matter has been at the forefront of lots of people's minds recently, and rightly so. It's highlighted a lot of what's going on, systemic racism, institutional racism, lots and lots of problems that are apparent throughout the world. However, if you ask anyone that's from an ethnic minority, they will say that we've been through these microaggressions all of our life, and we've been navigating what could only be referred to as traumatic experiences throughout our whole existence. Yet, despite that, we've been thinking about how do we overcome them and what can we do to kind of continue. It's either do you assimilate or you kind of move away from your situation to be able to be included. And there's lots and lots of studies that show, the main idea around Professor Miller talks about white sanction, needing somebody to be an ally for you, to allow for you to be a part and parcel of your organization, for example. But McKinsey report also states that actually through a diverse organization, you will actually just be more productive and more effective. And so, financially, there's no better gain to be diverse than you will just make more money. It will be better for your business if you are diverse. Yet, despite all of these clear rationales on what to improve, personally, as an individual, as an educator of just coming up to 15 years, I've had enough of reports, I've had enough of articles, I've had enough of all of these TV stations saying, oh, and people are still suffering from racism, and oh, and this is still happening. And, you can't get any more real than the fact that COVID-19 has highlighted me as a Pakistani male is twice more likely to die from this condition. You can't get any more real than that. And it's only now just started to kind of maybe simmer on the top of people's minds. And even then, people will still, from a place of privilege, either consciously or unconsciously say, but why? That doesn't make sense. I don't understand. Why is it that you are more likely to die than me? And I say, well, actually, because we need to look at this in the bigger picture. We need to look at this as part of who we are. Now, I've got a son who's of dual heritage. My wife is white Welsh. And one of the things that I had to navigate instantly was, what will I call my son? What will the name that represents my son B, because I know that my name as Amjad Ghazanfar Ali would put off certain employers, would put off certain people, would put off certain applications. So I need to think about, do I assimilate his name, or do I make a name that is westernized, and do I lose my cultural identity? And how many people have had to overcome all of these barriers? But aside from all of that, what we've done is we've set up a grassroots organization called BayMed. And BayMed is a completely free organization in which we have just started piecing together things that people want to know, people want to hear, people want to read. So we noticed a gap recently with COVID-19 and the lack of a risk assessment in institutions. So we wrote our own. We worked alongside the NHS and we wrote our own, and that's been picked up by thousands of people. And that's not because we have any more insight, just because there was a gap. We noticed a gap in how to organize an event, for example, where people will say to us, but we asked all of the people we know that are diverse. We picked all of the best people for the role. And I use the loose analogy, well, if you only play football with 11 people, obviously you got the best team. So, you know, you need to know where the variety of people are. So then we've created a speakers bank for people to say, actually, look, here you go. Here's tons of other people that you could look at. We've also organized toolkits on how to be an ally, etc., all for free, all volunteers. But it's just getting that message out there that there is things available for you. But one thing I'm noticing with my peers, with my colleagues, are especially black consultants, for example, are saying they're turning away work at the moment because they're only being approached right now because of Black Lives Matters, whereas actually they've been driving this for years and years and years. And actually, is the conscious only become awake now, or is it just a reaction? So it's something for us to reflect on. Am I going to do something meaningful, or am I just reacting? And that's where we need to really consider.
I think, Amjad, I think all of your tools and all of your resources, what we'll make sure is that we can share these out afterwards. Around all of our networks and our international schools, because actually they're approaching us, and we need to be pushing out and raising awareness further and further around, you know, the abilities and, you know, the fact that there are specific risk assessments around these aspects. I'd like to open up Angeline. She's with us today. Hi, Angeline. I actually know that you were a diversity appointment, weren't you, within your role? So I think you've got a sort of a similar perspective as Amjad.
Yeah, so when I first started my career, I had received a targeted graduate position in Sydney in Australia. And I was hired specifically to bring in diversity in a school where it was full of white Australians, and whereas the actual community itself had a few pockets of different nationalities in there. And it was an interesting experience. I was welcomed, but it was a challenge. You know, I sat in a staff room where people were saying things like, well, if people move to Australia, then they should become Christian. Yeah. And this was in the 2000s, right? And so you think it might be quite a long time ago, but it isn't. And that's in like multicultural Australia. And so from the very beginning of my teaching career, I've always been conscious that and really wanted to work towards better understanding of other cultures and intercultural, not only building intercultural understanding, but what some of the panelists have said before about the use of language, it really touched me. I myself migrated from Malaysia to Australia when I was 9, and my family chose to change my name. So I have a Chinese name, Ao Siu Siu, and when we migrated, I became Angeline Siu Siu Ao. And after 2 years, and then so they really went for assimilation as a thing. And now when I think about looking back on my career, I worked in Sydney for about 2.5 years, and then I started to teach internationally, and I went to Nanjing International School, where I thought I'm going to go and really try and work out and embrace my Chinese cultural heritage, because ethnically I come from Chinese people living for generations in Malaysia. But being an expatriate from Australia, but not looking like my other white colleagues, I was treated very differently too. And it wasn't because anyone was not, I mean, it was the microaggressions that you mentioned before. But also I myself hadn't grown into my full identity as either as an educator or as a young adult. And so I think it's imperative, I think, for our world to have a better understanding, because it is so linked to who we are as individuals, in personally, but also in relation to other people, and also within our contexts of where we are. And I think that if we're really to truly have an appreciation of diversity, yes, we do need to look for some commonalities, like when Cam mentioned, but we are all different also. And we need to celebrate our differences, because those differences are a fact, and they actually, they are it's our right to be different, and they're a rich resource also for schools.
Yeah.
Thank you, Angeline. Absolutely. I think celebration is actually another word that we need to be using more of, and linking to diversity. I'd like to open up, Shaneha. We've not had an opportunity for you to sort of introduce and welcome yourselves. Would you like to share with the panel some of your thoughts, because you've been working for 20 years in this field, so I'm sure we'd love to hear from you. You're on mute at the moment, Shaneha. Sorry. Wonders of technology.
I think after all the number of weeks with the lockdown, I'd be used to Zoom now. But it's a little Zoom thing, the little unmute that then comes up. So yes, I work predominantly with organisations in supporting them in developing their diversity and inclusion remit. And I've, as people have talked about Black Lives Matter. And a lot, I'm getting, contacts from a variety of organisations where they're saying things like, we now need to look at diversity and inclusion to, we need to have a bit more diverse representation, or we're getting staff members saying there's nobody who looks like me, and therefore I feel a little bit left out and I feel a little bit unsafe. And fundamentally, when we are talking about diversity and inclusion, I focus a lot on behaviours, language, but the bottom line is, how does it leave the person feeling? So people have talked about the microaggressions and the requirement to change names and feeling excluded. It really is very much about how do people feel, and not needing to justify themselves, whether it's because of their race or their gender or their sexuality. The two lines I've been hearing a lot, example of microaggressions are, where are you from? And then when I say I'm in Watford, no, where are you really from? Is a classic example of a microaggression. To another one where somebody was asked, what made you become gay? I've never been asked what made me become heterosexual. So it's about those kind of inclusion moments. From an education perspective, I'd like to share a lovely story that I was invited earlier this year by a head teacher of an infant school. And she recognised that the unconscious biases that were going on were not just within her staff team, but they were also going on within how staff were interacting with 4, 5, 7-year-olds. And she kind of asked for teachers to put names forward of the strongest children in their class, and all the teachers put forward boys' names. And then she had asked for teachers to put forward the names of the children who were the most helpful, and all the teachers put forward girls' names. And again, there's that whole gender stereotyping dynamic. And this particular head teacher then invited me to provide some training. We had a lot of discussions, and then she was going to be proactive. I have to say, when I left that school, I did leave with a smile on my face, because I thought, not only is the teacher really committed to putting things in place, 2, I was quietly confident that it wasn't just talk. She will continue to implement it. And thirdly, I was also really reassured that she's going to constantly review and check, one, how staff are feeling and what impact is it having on the children. And bearing in mind, it's not just the children, it's also the parents and carers who come into the equation. So it's about the whole element of how do staff interact, but what kind of service are we actually providing? And that's a key thing.
Yeah,
I think that's really powerful, actually, Sneha, the fact that people are, she didn't just have you in to tick a box. You
No.
felt when you went away, she was going to continue that.
Yes.
And that's where we are now. What we want to happen is for real change to happen, not for this to be just a knee-jerk reaction to what's happened, and then everyone sort of, it all goes away again.
And can I just add, there is a cynical part of me.
Oh, I think she's frozen.
She's frozen for a moment, bless her.
Yeah, but that is the thing, isn't it? We've got to keep the momentum going. So how do you feel that in your school, Claire, you could change? How can we nurture and help others understand, and the children?
It's a good question, actually, and I agree with everybody that it's not just for now. It's something that should be always on the agenda. Something I did when I first came here, because I did notice different terminology used or different cultural understanding.
With Black Lives Matter. So,
let me just drop Sinead a text and let her know that she's freezing. Do carry on, Claire.
Okay, so I actually held, I wouldn't have called it this, but I think I would now, is an unconscious bias workshop for my staff. So I had a PowerPoint, as you do, when the staff came in. And just coming in, I had slides up saying, draw an African child going to school, draw an Asian child getting water. And it was really interesting, the stereotypes just that people drew, maybe a child without shoes on going to school in certain clothes, or a child holding water on their head. And then I had pictures of, an African child in a wonderful, and I don't actually like the term African because it's massive, but actually it was a Nigerian child on this occasion, in a beautiful tartan uniform with shiny black shoes, going to school in a very smart area. And I think I'd said a Nepalese child getting water, and it was somebody sitting in a bar with bottled water. And it's just challenging how we present your stereotypical views. So alerting people to the language, and how, if you use, when you're teaching, it's really important to use the positive language, because if you're talking about a mud hut, that they're saying somebody in Kenya lives in a mud hut, well, it's a house, it's not a mud hut. We talk about huts in a different way. So use a language that presents in a positive way. And even down to the literature we use, you might say, well, actually for me, if you have a book corner, it should be completely diverse. You should be going in, and it should be a mirror of your children and even beyond the communities you have. But also, again, back to that positive light. If you're presenting rural Africa in the books you've got, because there are some lovely books, but they can be quite traditional, but you're only presenting that, and then you're presenting Europe as a very sort of high-rise flats and rich country, you're not giving the right picture either. You have to show that there are oil-rich countries in Asia, or the continent of Asia or Africa, and present all those positive role models, and not to make sure that you're imbalanced in your teaching. So I think that's really important, to educate your staff before they educate the children, to make sure they're using the correct terminology, they're giving positive role models. And that's gender as well. We hold a lot of gender workshops here, where we make sure that exactly what we said, that we're looking at girls in maths and making sure that we understand that they may not be shouting the loudest, but their ability is just as strong, so that we're not negatively impacting on any group. And people sometimes, it's the word unconscious is really important, because I think often people are not deliberately misrepresenting a group, but it can happen.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. We do actually have a question from Jared, who's with us. Looking at representation, how do school leaders support LGBTQ and staff in the international sector, particularly in those schools and countries where those rights are not protected, tolerated or celebrated? And Sinead, you've actually sort of written a response here, but would you like to actually, share that with the audience? You're on mute again, Sinead.
It's yeah, so thank you. I think at the end of the day, the law of the land is the law of the land, and that's something that stands as it is. And as I've said in my response, there are 2 points for consideration. What are the consequences if you are in a country where if somebody was to disclose their sexuality, what would be the consequences at a wider societal political level? But if you are an international school, what are your internal policies, procedures, and practices, informal as well as formal practices, where you can support the individual? But I think generically, as an international school, it would be within the frame of the law of the land. It would be important for you to have good discussions with within the staff team and with people accessing the school education system to talk about LGBTQ. And there's also the A now, where, as had been discussed earlier, there is a real prominence about either being a white ally or it's about being an ally, where you're not representative part of that group, but you still support and fight for their cause. So it's about the internal practices. And this needs to be discussed within the school itself, rather than just one person taking the lead.
Yeah, absolutely. Amjad, did you have any sort of thoughts or experience around LGBTQ that you can share with us?
So in the UK we have...
Are you still on mute, I think, Amjad?
I think I've unmuted.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, you're there.
So in the UK, we have an organisation, I'm sure there's lots of others that do similar work, but an organisation called Educate and Celebrate, which work towards accrediting schools in becoming LGBTQ plus inclusive schools. And there's lots of work that you can do within those areas. But one thing I would say that is coupled with any question to do with any kind of intersectionality would be that the people that are within that group shouldn't be the sole drivers of that group, and that shouldn't be on their responsibility to drive those groups forward always. I mean, we set up BAMED as BAME people, but we have a diversity of people within the steering group and a diversity of people within the founders to ensure that there is a diversity of experience. It'd be ironic if we set up a group that wasn't diverse itself. So it's important for people that are keen and interested and rightly pushing forward this movement to not be the people that have to overcome all of the difficulties throughout their experiences as well.
Thank you, Amjad. Pam, did you have anything you wanted to share?
No. So I was going to say, Amjad, do you have any resources we can share about how we can nurture developing better understanding of diversity with ourselves, with each other, and within our school communities?
So yeah, on our website we have, for example, reading, and I mean, there's lots of studies that show that racism is you're not born with racism, so you're taught and learned racism. So we need to get into the books right from the outset, right from the start. And so we have with Books Keeps as an organization that have compiled a list of diverse books for us. So we want people to get these books into their libraries. We also want people to think about this notion of decolonizing their curriculum, and also not just think that they have a diverse curriculum if the only elements of their curriculum is the anguish of Black or ethnic minorities within their curriculum. So they need to celebrate the successes and the broad experiences of ethnic minorities. I mean, one of the simple ways for example, I'm an English teacher, and we looked at the word quarantine, and quarantine has been associated with an Italian professor, whereas actually it was way before that in the Middle East, and an Arab medicine doctor actually come up with this idea of quarantine and putting something aside for 40 days at a time. So it's looking at etymology and roots and history of things, and not just presenting Black lives as an anguished element of Black lives, and curriculum development in that way. So yeah, we've got resources on there, but really it's about investing in time and using the expertise that's out there. So we've tried to get that out as much as possible. But really, I've come to the point, and it might sound a little bit passive aggressive, but people have got to start educating themselves now. And I've had enough of constantly people saying, what can I do? And what should I do? And yeah, I'm there, I'll help you, but only to a certain extent. And the rest needs to be, you now need to learn. I don't know much about LGBTQ+, because that's not my experience, but I'm learning that for me to gain my experience in that area. So other people need to pick up the kind of helm in that way.
Coming back to your point, apparently it's 11 before children develop that prejudice, etc.
Yeah,
So we have a really great window as educators to get those books into our classrooms, to get them to form their own opinions. Because I have grown-up children of 21 and 20, and quite often we'll be at the dinner table, they'll say to my husband, well, no, that's not the case, this is how we perceive it. But you know, it's like they have to get to that age, but I'd like them to be able to do that at 10 and go, actually, I don't think that's the case. And if we can educate them well enough in our schools, that would be the way to move forward. Because sometimes it's very difficult to undo work that's done.
And the point in hand is that the reason why it can't just be the marginalized groups driving this, because there's not enough of us. So if in a school percentage of around 8 to 10% in UK schools, us 8 to 10% can't do it anyway. So everyone else has to.
We probably can. We're strong enough.
We're strong enough, but then it becomes one of those things where that's where the labels of an angry, intimidating ethnic minority gets born out of, rather than being an assertive, driven person. I know that some of the female, will have been given that label as opposed to driven and motivated, and so you know, it's yeah, absolutely. I hear what you're saying.
So, Angeline, we asked everyone to have a couple of Sorry, Georgie, were you going to say something?
No, that's fine. That's absolutely, you carry on.
Okay. So, Angeline, we were going to ask everyone to have a couple of takeaways for us with what the webinar's name was. Yeah? How can we make change? What can we do? What are your takeaways for our audience? Hello?
Yeah, so I think... Okay. Hi. Yeah, so the big takeaways, I think a lot of people here have mentioned unconscious bias and having awareness of what we believe and what's driving us and the perceptions in which we have. And I think for me, one of the big things that you know, I've been working on is looking at, you know, those stereotypes, and stereotypes are neither good nor bad. But it's actually, they are there because they're also a part of how we organize the world and the language in which we use, right? And so actually the generalizations that we form, we have to be aware of what are actually our actions that we take based on our perceptions of the world. And that is where we can intervene. Is our perception of the world biased, and because the action that we're taking is then discriminatory against someone else, or is it possibly even affirmatory to a certain group, right? So your actions as teachers, you know, so if I have a certain perception about a certain group of kids who I think are going to be lazy, then they're not going to get this work because of whatever socioeconomic class or racial ethnicity that they come from, then generally that teacher is going to think they're going to choose materials that are actually not lower than what the kids can achieve, right? And so yes, we need to be more aware of those biases, but we need to be aware of how they drive the decision making that we do on a daily basis as teachers and also as leaders of schools. And that is also a personal journey, as I was saying, that we need to go on that journey to become more aware, but also aware of the implications of our actions on a personal, on a class level, but as an institutional level as well. And I think that to do that, we need to do this on a long-term basis with lots of conversations, but also looking at policies and looking at, do we have safe and secure places where we can have these conversations without feeling like we're going to be seen as either being angry or to be reprimanded for bringing it up, which is also coming up a lot in the media right now. And so having the psychological safety in order to have these conversations that will hopefully change our beliefs and perceptions into a greater sense of an awareness of how these drive the actions that we take that have a big impact on the kids that we are under our care.
Thank you so much for that.
Can I just suggest it? We have panelists with us at the moment, so if anyone is actually listening in on the webinar and you'd like to actually share some more questions, we're all here happy to sort of share our thoughts and opinions, so please feel free to pop your questions in the Q&A box for everybody. Cam, did you want to
So thank you. So Claire, as well, for you at your school, moving forward, making progress. Well, what are your takers? What can we do that will make a difference right now?
I think we talked about curriculum and inclusion on the curriculum. I think politely challenge is a good way to.
Wanting it politely challenge.
Yes, a good way to move forward. Since I've been here for several years, I have politely challenged our governing body that have not been as representative of our school community and said, you know, when we're looking for our new governors, do you think perhaps we should have more women and more diversity on our governing body? And it's working as well. It is happening, but you get maybe the classic, well, we don't find these people, or, you know, we're not sure where they are. And like in many places, we've got that real hire like me mentality. Yeah. I think since I've been here at St. George's, almost 30% of our staff represent different groups now. I think when I came, there were 2 staff members. So it's looking at your hiring practices and looking at how you can include people, say, from all groups, because that strengthens your team, and all groups at all levels. So within your staffing, but it is asking those questions, always questioning, always asking.
So you're politely challenging, but because you're politely challenging, it's making them think about it and then act on it. It's actually a whole effect, isn't it?
I hope so. And even if it doesn't happen right now, you know, if you continue to politely challenge, you know, you can say it once, and sometimes I feel a bit of a nag. It's like, oh, it's me again saying the same thing. But if you don't, then, you know, I have to be able to respect myself as well.
Of course you do. You have to prompt to get that challenging. Yeah. So Neha, do you have something to share with us around how we can move forward and make progress? Hello? You're here.
Okay, can you hear me? I can't believe it, this is the 3rd time. Okay, so I think there are 3 things that a school or an institution, education institution can do. One is at a practical level to do a diversity audit and to really look at everything, all their systems, all their informal practices, their policies, their procedures, and look at a review of where do they stand. And within that review, they might want to look at what language patterns are people using, what's the behavior like, and then come up with some form of action plan in response to that. I can't emphasize the value of doing a diversity audit, and you could even do a diversity audit about how reception is working. You know, when I come in, if I were to come into your school, what would be the reception area like? Do I feel valued and included? Is there good representation of diversity in the surround areas? If I went into your website, is there good representation? So number 1 is diversity audit. Number 2, what I find organizations are doing is those senior leaders who are committed to diversity at a informal level already have systems, mechanisms in place. And rather than just focusing on how terrible we are, let's also look at what you're doing well around diversity. And I call it celebrate diversity. And what research has shown over and over again, the more you celebrate diversity and the more you share what you're doing well, the likelihood of you maintaining it and doing more then automatically goes up.
And then great, isn't it? Because we've so got into this cycle when we're just focusing on ourselves and we're not doing quite well. But actually celebrate it. That is really great. That is actually.
Yeah. And number 3, I know you said 2, but I'm going to go for number 3. I feel that in anything that you do, always keep it on the agenda. So whether you're talking about school meals, whether you're talking about curriculum, whether you're talking even about staff going out and doing some form of team building, always ask the question, where is diversity and inclusion in this? And rather than just talking about it, there always needs to be some form of action point and then some form of taking responsibility and accountability because, as I said earlier, talk is cheap, and it can be very seductive to talk about diversity, because then people think, well, if she's talking about it, she must be very good. But if talking is to a point, it's about the taking action. That's actually the evidence of implementing and embedding diversity into everything.
Yeah, thank you.
I can see Angeline's nodding here. Did you have any additional comments on what Shanae has just said?
Yeah, I mean, it was, thank you for that, Shanae. It's such practical tips that you were giving. I wish we had time for more than 3, but I just was nodding emphatically because of the action part, and because the actions that we take, they're the ones that are going to create that workplace culture, and they're the ones that reiterate those rationalizations that we have, and that form what's common behavior, or what's become systemic, right? And so if we're conscious about how our biases or beliefs and perceptions are all driving that, and like you said, how we're keeping diversity at the heart of everything we do, and being inclusive of as well in how we do it, then hopefully we're creating repeated actions that will then become more permanent into creating a more inclusive place for everybody, where everyone's safe for all.
Yeah.
Thank you, Angeline.
Amjad, do you have some takeaways for us?
I mean, lots of colleagues have shared some really useful takeaways. My final takeaway would just be that about 5 years ago, going to a restaurant and asking for a vegan, vegetarian, halal, or meat-free option, dairy-free option would have been scorned upon. However, now it's happening, it's normal, it's part and parcel of our society. So we can get there. We just got to keep on pushing towards what we want to see. But we need people to be able to push alongside us. So I always use a phrase, I don't need you to open the door for me into the room. I need you to be able to give me a seat at the table as well. So it's very similar to the phrase, diversity is about being invited to the party, but inclusion is being invited to dance. So it's about thinking about what we're doing in those areas as well, and not just for me, but for everyone.
They're really, really great analogies, actually. That's brilliant. And you're right, actually, now you can go to a vegan restaurant, but 5 years ago you couldn't.
And from that kind of bias, I actually am gluten-free, and Cam has been with me in various locations when we've been travelling where I've actually been refused a food in a restaurant because they're not prepared to feed me. So there is a similar analogy there around sort of inclusion, and that's probably the closest that I've felt to any kind of bias at all. And feeling awkward and uncomfortable, and all of those sensations that I imagine that other people have experienced. Claire, did you have any other kind of comments or sort of final takeaways for us as we start to wrap up?
I've got a takeaway.
Cam, I'll ask you in a moment.
I would just say that it's actually a real pleasure hearing everybody else's views, and just, I mean, I've got a whole sheet already of takeaways for myself that I'm going to go and look at, and things I can include in what I'm doing. But I do think it is everybody's responsibility, and I think perhaps for too long it hasn't been everybody's responsibility, and it shouldn't just be a small group. And certainly somebody like myself can be an ally, and that's what we need more of. If everybody were to join together, we really wouldn't be in the position that we're in the past few weeks. If we just, I think many people have the belief in diversity and inclusion, so we just need to fight a little harder and really be a bit more committed.
Yeah, it's exactly what Angelina and Sneha said as well. It shouldn't just be we're doing a bit of diversity, it should inform all the things we're doing. Yeah, it should be always there.
Yeah.
So for me, I've been having lots of conversations with people when they go, well, why do you feel like this, or why did they feel like this on telly? And I said to them, I said, these are really futile conversations. You don't need to understand why. What I'd like you to do is look at yourself and say, how can I stop this? How can I make this better? what is the little change I can bring? Because a lot of these conversations coming from people who've never ever been subjected to any discrimination or prejudice, it's very difficult. So I said to them, I think you just need to stop that. And you know, what we need to do is we need to be the change that we want to see happen. What are the little things we can all do every day and think, actually, you know, again, it's coming back to what you were saying as well about challenging behaviours, and then they prompt a different action, don't they?
And can I just add, you know, when we are talking about the change that you want to, you know, it's very much about the organizational ethos, cultures, how much is it aligned with its values. Angeline talked about the psychological safety. Do people feel safe and capable and competent to be able to contribute when things aren't going well? But I also think, parallel to all of this, certainly with the organizations I've worked with, emotional intelligence plays a huge part in managing diversity, because if there's a level of self-awareness, and then that's kind of reflected into behaviors with how you interact, because the flip side to that is I do investigations into allegations of bullying and harassment. And that's because it hasn't been contained, and then it explodes where somebody has inadvertently said something to somebody else. It really is to do with somebody feeling excluded, and how that's managed as well. So for me, the bottom line is look at what your organizational ethos and culture is about, and how far is it aligned with values. Certainly in the lockdown, I'm hearing a lot more about kindness. I'm hearing a lot more about compassion. And I think those are really good starts.
Yeah, yeah, no, you're absolutely right. They're at the root of everything, actually, aren't they? Emotional intelligence, compassion and kindness. Thank you. Thank you so much for all your time and for all the wonderful experiences and knowledge that you've shared with us. Before we finish today, we just wanted to share that we work very closely with International School Stuttgart, and they're running a course about understanding intercultural behaviours in schools, etc. And it's a framework that's been developed by Deborah Rader. So if you do have time, do you know, go to the workshop.
Excellent. And also anyone that's on the panel who will be able to share any kind of resources. We will be sharing out a recording of today's webinar as well. So any sort of key areas. Angeline, I know you shortly have a webinar that you're also hosting as part of Women Ed. Did you want to just mention that to everybody as well?
Yes, sure. Thank you. And actually, the institute that you have there, it's Deborah Rader and Sarah Kopke,
Yes.
as well as Heidi Bachmann. And Heidi Bachmann is going to be one of our panelists with Delina Nadronmana, who, and the two of them are with Kyra Kellawan. The four of us are going to also hold a conversation about representation for women in education and in educational leadership. And that will take place on Tuesday, the 7th of July at 8 p.m. Central European Summertime.
Brilliant. If you want to share the link with us, we'll certainly push that out as well, Angeline. I think that would be really useful to follow on from these discussions.
Thank you very much.
That's okay. And you know, obviously we're delighted that you've actually taken the time to join us today. Amjad looks like he may have dropped off the call. So Amjad, are you still with us, or I think, yeah, he's probably gone, but we're really, really grateful. We know that you're all such busy professional individuals. Certainly some of those are you at school trying to wrap up for the end of term. And Shneha, thank you for your continued wonderful work, that, you know, spreading the word. And I love all the practical tips that you were sharing today as well. And we would absolutely be delighted to be able to share some of those out to our colleagues and our international community. It makes me very proud to work in such a diverse and sort of celebrated organisation, and have the opportunity to work with such professionals as yourself. So extremely grateful for your time today, and we hope that we can continue these conversations and really truly make a difference.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.